Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. That right back there, that's Kate Batts. That's Chuck Cheese. We're gonna roll. This is a Knowledgia? Yeah. The British-American War of 1812, explained in 1-3 minutes. So let's get into it.
In 1812, the young nation of the United States took on the country with the most powerful navy in the world in a war that would affect more than just the former colonies and their colonizer. The United States of America first gained freedom from the British in an 8-year-long Revolutionary War that finally came to a close when Britain inevitably recognized the independence of their 13 former colonies on September 3rd, 1783. One of the most relevant impacts of this war that would fuel future tensions between the US and Britain once again was the role of the Native Americans. And as a fan of our channel, you should check out our friends over at CuriosityStream. This is my personal favorite streaming service, a place where I can watch thousands of incredible
Thanks, CuriosityStream.
The rivalry between both nations and the details of the war, also named the Second American War of Independence.
Oh, I didn't go far enough,
This war was very important because it could have changed history as we know it. Because you are...
Thanks, CuriosityStream, again.
During the Revolution, the Native Americans mostly supported the Brits, who they hoped would continue to restrict expansion from the US settlers into Native American territory. When Britain failed to maintain its rule over the colonies, the United States eventually accelerated its takeover of native land, causing even more friction between the American societies. This friction only grew stronger as the years went on, as Britain remained a driving force of the discord, since not only had the natives taken its side in the Revolution, but the British also openly encouraged the Native Americans to fight back against their antagonists. By 1812,
I just want to say, not to nitpick here, but the UK did the same thing during the... So let's go back to the French and Indian War. The natives, the French and natives were fighting the UK and the colonies with the help of some of the tribes. Fast forward 10-12 years later, War of Independence. We, with the help of France and some tribes, were facing the UK with the help of the Prussians and Prussia and tribes. Fast forward to the War of 1812. We are facing the UK with the help of some tribes facing other tribes. So this is something that they were using against us, and at the same time, at the conclusion of every one of those wars, they turned their back on those natives. So a lot of things that happened after that war, after the War of 1812, where America, the early Americans, were casting out a lot of those natives. You have to understand that was because they were being used to rise up against us. So, you know, the Americans didn't want anything to do with them. It's not fair, but at the same time, it's kind of a what did you expect? It put them in a bad situation, but in the end, we didn't look at who helped us and who fought us. We just categorized them all together and shipped them out. Not fair to all, but again, you don't know who you're fighting after a while. They're all just...
This, combined with a few other factors, led to the development of a new war. While the United States was clearly unhappy with the united opposition from Britain and the natives, they were also infuriated by allegations that the Royal Navy was utilizing a tactic known as impressment to take US men for their own troops. On top of this, the ongoing strife between Britain and France had a notable impact on the United States. Heavily locked in their own struggle, the warring nations tried to restrict trade from neutral countries and punish anyone who attempted to ignore the constraints. This put the United States in a detrimental position due to their inability to continue trade with either nation unless they wanted to risk invoking the wrath of the other side. While France took a more laid-back approach to ensure the US abstained from doing business with the British, the latter was more aggressive about the matter. On January 7, 1807, Britain issued an order in council stating, "It is hereby ordered that no vessel shall be permitted to trade from one port to another, both which ports shall belong to or be in the possession of France or her allies, or shall be so far under their control as the British vessels may not freely trade." Furthermore, any ships that refused to obey these restrictions would be subject to seizure by the Royal Navy, cargo and all. By November, the original order was expanded, now to include all the ports and places of France and her allies, or of any other country at war with His Majesty, and all other ports or places in Europe, from which, although not at war with His Majesty, the British flag is excluded, and all ports or places in the colonies belonging to His Majesty's enemies. In retaliation, France, under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte, issued the Milan Decree, which said that every ship, to whatever nation it may belong, that shall have submitted to be searched by an English ship or to a voyage to England, or shall have paid any tax whatsoever to the English government, is thereby, and for that alone, declared to be denationalized, to have forfeited the protection of its king, and to have become English property. Adding on, Napoleon declared that any of the aforementioned ships that enter French ports or those of French allies are good and lawful prizes of his nation. Forced to reply, U.S. President Thomas Jefferson signed the Embargo Act in December of 1807, blocking all international trade from American ports and taking direct aim at Britain. Unfortunately for America, the act backfired and turned the U.S. into more of a victim than anyone else.
The import, export, the taxes, like, I don't know the numbers offhand, but we went from, let's say, like $175 million to $14 million. Like, in a year. It was a massive hit. Something that James Madison was trying to get out of. And Thomas Jefferson did his usual thing where he just talked trash about you in the press.
Emphasizing this point, the Minister to France himself even said, "Here it is not felt, and in England it is forgotten." The effects of the Embargo Act ultimately pushed the U.S. into an economic depression, and it had to be repealed less than 2 years after the initial signature. In its place, the Non-Intercourse Act was passed, which directly forbade trade with Britain and France and their colonies. When this new act still proved to be ineffective, the United States tried once again, this time passing Macon's Bill No. 2 in May of 1810. This bill lifted trading bans and stated that if either France or Britain removed their own restrictions, the U.S. would re-establish an embargo with the opposing nation. By August, Napoleon enacted a plan to exacerbate tension between Britain and the United States, and it ultimately worked. He first told the new president, James Madison, that he intended to exempt the U.S. from his previously established Berlin and Milan decrees, promoting Madison to bring back the Non-Intercourse Act constraints against Britain in November of that year. Despite the fact that Napoleon never actually followed through on his proclamation, Britain and the United States were now on the brink of all-out war. The final straw came when the Battle of Tippecanoe unfolded in late 1811, as the U.S. troops claimed victory over the Native Americans, wishing to stop further expansion once again. Given the United States was fairly confident in the belief that the British were supplying the natives with weapons from Canada, a faction of the U.S. Republican Party known as the War Hawks began a heavy push towards an official declaration of war.
The Battle of Tippecanoe, by the way, was led by future 9th president, shortest span in history, 30-some days. But that was William Henry Harrison, who was the, as he liked to call himself, Washington of the West. But that was the Battle of Tippecanoe was the death of Tecumseh, the Native American leader. And I lost track of what I was going to say now. Oh, but the battle, side note, has nothing to do with that. William Henry Harrison and his vice president, John Tyler, they got elected with the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So let that little Tippecanoe and Tyler too, let that little jingle get stuck in your head. And that was what won him the presidency.
At last, on June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed the Declaration against Britain, despite contention about the issue coming from both the House and Senate. Another problem emerged as well when Britain decided to suddenly repeal their trade restrictions before news of the U.S. declaration of war actually reached the British over a month later. Aware of this delay, Britain decided not to immediately respond to the call of war and waited to see how the Americans would react to their repeals. When the US got wind of this surprising development, they were, in turn, unsure of how the Brits would react to their declaration of war. Ultimately, the United States decided to follow through on its proclamation and did so by invading Canada, which was a British colony at the time. While the American troops hoped to capture Canadian land to force Britain into negotiation, they had no such success. No one was prepared for war. The British and French have been busy fighting their own battles, and the US military was grossly ill-suited to take on the likes of Britain. The defeats were plenty and humiliating for the Americans. One excessively humbling loss for the US happened when General William Hull surrendered Fort Detroit on August 16, 1812, and his own army to the British troops, and allowed Michigan territory to be deemed as part of Britain. Chased across the Canadian border, as Hull saw the size of his opponent's forces, which was a mix of British and Native American troops, and knowing that his daughter and grandchild were in the fort, he decided to give up without a single shot being fired. Hull's disgraceful failure led to an uptick in Native American raids in the Northwest and British conflict under the command of Major General Henry Proctor. Adding insult to injury, U.S. Brigadier General Henry Dearborn struggled to make any progress on the northeastern border because the militias in New England were not supportive of the war and uninterested in coming together for an attack on Montreal. By October, the Americans were finally able to get some momentum as Major General Stephen von Rensselaer led an army of 3,100 militiamen into the Battle of Queenston Heights. Rensselaer sent some advanced units across the river where they were able to hold their ground for some time on a slope just above Queenston and were successful until they were overcome by British forces as the rest of the American troops refused to join the fight. 925 U.S. soldiers were then captured by the British, despite Major General Isaac Brock on the British side being killed during the battle. Yet again, the Americans took another hit in 1813 when an attempt to retake Detroit resulted in a massacre of U.S. prisoners by their Native American opponents. On top of that, Brigadier General Henry Dearborn was replaced by Major General James Wilkins At long last, though, in September of 1813, U.S. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry scored a major naval victory at Lake Erie against the forces of British Captain Robert Barclay and opened the gates for more success on the American side. When the Battle of the Thames erupted the following month, the U.S. finally defeated the British and Native American Allied forces. The next spring season, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, a U.S. militia force faced off with a Native American force known as the Red Sticks and found victory once again, demanding that the losing side cede roughly 23 million acres of land, which would later become Alabama and span partially into Georgia.
I believe the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, I believe that was Andrew Jackson. I'm going to look it up, though, because I don't want to misspeak. Andrew Jackson, Battle of Horseshoe Bend. On the night of March 26, 1814, Major General Andrew Jackson and a contingent of 3,300 regulars, militiamen, Cherokee and Lower Creek, camped 6 miles north of... Yep. Jackson's forces destroyed the Creek defense at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. More than 800 Creek warriors were killed defending their homeland. Okay. Yeah, let me see. This is 1814. So William Henry Harrison resigned his commission. And I want to say he resigned it 1813, 1814. Had he not resigned it, Jackson would not have kind of filled that power vacuum, that void, and Jackson would have been a name, but Harrison had a bigger name at the start of the war. At the end of the war, it was all Jackson.
Another win for the United States followed in the summer, July of 1814, at the Battle of Chippewa, but it was short-lived, as the Battle of Lundy's Lane ended in a bloody stalemate shortly after, forcing the Americans to withdraw. The real deciding factor in the war came when Napoleon faced his first exile, allowing Britain to shift more focus to the discord with the United States. The British sliced through the U.S., destroying government buildings, including the White House, as they took control of Washington, D.C. The Brits then tried to push farther into Baltimore by September under the authority of General Robert Ross, but were repulsed at the Battle of North Point, where General Ross was killed. In the battle that inspired the U.S. national anthem, more British troops were fought off at Fort McHenry. As these conflicts raged on, peace talks began in Ghent and eventually resulted in a signed treaty on December 24th, 1814. Still, just as with the declaration of war, the news was delayed and took until February 18, 1815 to officially be ratified and end the war. The Treaty of Ghent reverted things back mostly to how they were before the combat, with a status quo antebellum. All territory was returned. Britain repealed their trade restrictions, stopped supporting the Native American revolts, and ended their impressment strategies. In the end, the war was essentially a draw, and the only real losing side was the Native Americans, who had high hopes for British help in stopping U.S. expansion. Britain was able to claim victory against the French, and in a way, against the U.S. Meanwhile, the U.S. had the pride of more or less winning their second war of independence.
In the end, even though it was a draw, because America was not the power that the UK was, I gotta say America won. But at the same time, I think it was such an insignificant... I think the burning of the White House was... which apparently in the UK did not go off very... There were a lot of unhappy politicians in Parliament who thought that was just disgusting. But I think the burning of the White House was supposed... It was retaliation for the U.S. burning a town in Canada. But I think they really thought that burning the White House signified America would give up. And they didn't realize that we had learned to just move. Just move, you know, dating back to the Revolutionary War. We went from, you know, things shut down in Williamsburg. Okay, we just, from at the governor's mansion. So they just went to taverns. And then DC, Philadelphia, moving all around. Like, as long as the people are there, you can have a government anywhere. As long as the people are there, you don't need a significant building. And that was the one thing that we learned pretty early on. So I'm going to end this here. This is an interesting video. It was short, but, you know, if you didn't know much about it, it's interesting. So there's a thanks button on the channel. You can donate. You don't have to. Subscribe, click the bell if this type of stuff is interesting, or you've seen other videos that I've done that's interesting. Give a thumbs up. That helps. And until next time, just have a good day. Have a good night.